You know, there are moments in life when you think you've finally learned to stop hoping, when you convince yourself that disappointment can't touch you anymore because you've built walls thick enough to keep it out. I thought I had reached that place at 73 years old, sitting in my small apartment with its faded wallpaper and the clock that ticks just a little too loud in the silence, the same silence that had become my most faithful companion, never leaving me, never surprising me with false promises or broken commitments. But then the phone rang that Tuesday morning in October, cutting through the quiet like a blade through silk. My daughter's voice carried something I hadn't heard in years, warmth, genuine warmth that seemed to reach through the phone line and wrap around my chest like a forgotten embrace. "Mom, this year is going to be different. We want you to come for Thanksgiving. Don't worry about anything. We'll pick you up. We'll handle everything." The words fell into my chest like warm honey, sweet and golden, and impossible to resist. For the first time in so long, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I still belonged somewhere, that maybe the woman I'd been before grief and loneliness had worn her edges smooth still existed underneath all those years of careful disappointment. I had no idea that this moment of hope would lead me to discover something far more valuable than any family dinner could ever be. The woman I was when nobody else was watching, when nobody else was keeping score. If stories like this touch your heart, please subscribe and ring that notification bell, because sometimes the most powerful journeys begin with the smallest acts of faith, and I'd love to share more of these moments with you. Trust me, what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about belonging. The days that followed that phone call felt different, like someone had adjusted the lighting in my small apartment, just enough to make everything seem possible again. I found myself humming while I watered my African violets, the same tune my mother used to sing while she kneaded bread on Sunday mornings, "In the Sweet By and By," a hymn that tasted like cinnamon and safety. The apartment seemed brighter somehow, as if someone had opened curtains I didn't even know were closed, letting in light that had been waiting patiently outside my windows for permission to enter. I caught myself looking in the mirror more often, tilting my head to see if the woman staring back still had something worth dressing up, worth celebrating, worth seeing. The mirror in my hallway had witnessed every version of me over the past 40 years. The young mother rushing out to school, plays and soccer games, mascara hastily applied, hair barely brushed, but heart full of purpose. The middle-aged woman preparing for job interviews after Harold died, trying to convince both herself and potential employers that she still had value to offer the world. The widow learning to see her face without his reflection beside it, learning to recognize herself as singular rather than half of a whole. Now, at 73, I was looking for something I wasn't sure I'd recognize: hope. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I made a decision that felt both reckless and necessary, the kind of choice that announces itself before your rational mind has time to talk you out of it. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the envelope from behind my Bible, the one wedged between the pages of Psalms and Proverbs, where David's words about walking through valleys kept my secrets safe. Inside were $20 bills folded thin as tissue paper, each one representing a small sacrifice, a meal skipped, a prescription delayed, a coffee shop visit I'd denied myself because saving seemed more important than living. $247. Not much to most people, but to me, it represented months of tiny acts of faith in a future I wasn't sure would come. Each bill had a story. The 20 I'd saved by walking to the pharmacy, instead of taking the bus during that ice storm in February. The 20 I'd kept by buying generic cereal instead of the brand I'd eaten for 60 years. The 20 I'd earned by selling Harold's watch to the pawn shop on Market Street, swallowing my pride with each step toward the counter. This wasn't just money, it was proof that I still believed tomorrow might be worth preparing for. Standing there with those bills in my weathered hands, I could smell Harold's aftershave still lingering in the bedroom, could hear his voice saying what he always said when I worried about spending money. "Honey, what good is saving for tomorrow if you forget to live today?" He'd been dead for 4 years, But his wisdom had a way of showing up exactly when I needed it most, like a letter from heaven delivered by memory. I counted the bills one more time, feeling their softness between my fingers, thinking about all the things this money could buy that made practical sense. Groceries for 2 months, new shoes to replace the ones with worn soles, medicine I'd been rationing to make it last longer. But then I thought about my daughter's voice on the phone, about the possibility of belonging somewhere again, about the woman I wanted to be when she looked at me across that Thanksgiving table, and I made a choice that scared and thrilled me in equal measure. Downtown, I walked into Morrison's department store with purpose I hadn't felt in years, my shoulders straight and my steps deliberate, despite the arthritis that had taken residence in my knees like an unwelcome tenant who refused to leave. The store smelled like expensive perfume and new beginnings, like the department stores of my youth when shopping was an event, not an errand. The saleswoman who approached me was young enough to be my granddaughter, with kind eyes the color of summer sky and silver nail polish that caught the light like small mirrors on her fingertips. "What are you looking for, ma'am?" she asked, and something about the genuine interest in her voice, the way she looked at me like I was someone worth helping rather than someone to hurry through a transaction, made me answer with more honesty than I'd planned. "Something that makes me feel alive again," I said, the words surprising us both with their raw truth. She smiled then, not the polite smile of customer service, but the real smile of recognition, like she understood exactly what I meant, like she'd been waiting her whole life to help someone find their way back to themselves. She guided me through the store with the confidence of someone who understood that shopping for the right thing isn't about finding what fits your body, but what fits your soul. The coat section stretched before us like a garden of possibilities. Hangers lined up like soldiers waiting for deployment, each garment carrying its own promise of transformation. Navy coats that whispered of reliability, brown coats that spoke of earth and practicality, black coats that suggested sophistication and safe choices. But then I saw it, hanging like a flame among the safer colors, demanding attention without apology. There it was, a red wool coat with pearl buttons that caught the store's fluorescent lights and threw them back like tiny stars. The collar was designed to frame a face, to announce that the woman wearing it had something to say, and wasn't afraid to say it loudly. Not burgundy, not maroon, not any of the muted versions of red that older women are supposed to choose to avoid drawing attention to themselves. This was true red, the color of Christmas mornings when my children were small and believed in magic, the color of the lipstick I used to wear when Harold still noticed such things, the color of roses from the garden I once tended with such fierce devotion. When I slipped it on, something inside me straightened that had been bent for years. The wool was soft as a prayer against my skin, warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with feeling seen, feeling worthy, feeling like someone who deserved beautiful things. The sleeves fell perfectly at my wrists. The hem hit exactly where it should, and the color, oh, the color made my eyes look brighter, made my silver hair look intentional rather than resigned, made me look like someone who had stories worth telling. The young saleswoman stepped back and clasped her hands together like she was watching magic happen in real time. "Oh my," she breathed, and I could see in her expression what I was afraid to hope, that I looked transformed, that the coat hadn't just covered my body, but had somehow revealed the woman I'd forgotten I could be. She walked around me slowly, adjusting the collar just so, smoothing the shoulders with the care of someone arranging flowers, making sure every detail was perfect. "You look absolutely stunning," she said, and there was no flattery in her voice, no attempt to make a sale through false compliments. There was only honest admiration, the kind that makes you stand up straighter because someone is seeing the best version of you and reflecting it back like sunlight off water. I turned to look at myself in the three-way mirror, and for the first time in years, I didn't look away quickly, didn't focus on the flaws and the ways time had changed my face and body. I saw a woman in a red coat. I saw someone who belonged in beautiful things, who deserved to take up space in the world, who had earned the right to be noticed and admired and seen. The coat transformed me, but more than that, it gave me permission to transform myself, to remember that beauty isn't the exclusive property of the young, that wanting to be seen isn't vanity when you've spent too many years learning to be invisible. The price tag read $189, and I stood there for what felt like an hour, holding that small piece of cardboard between my weathered fingers like it held the secret to my future, the practical voice in my head, the one that had learned to expect disappointment, to prepare for the worst, to save every penny for emergencies that might never come, whispered all the reasons I shouldn't spend so much money on something so impractical, so frivolous, so purely for joy rather than necessity. As I hung up those carefully saved bills, feeling the weight of months of small sacrifices transferring from my weathered hands to hers, I thought about Harold and how he would have laughed at my practicality, not mockingly, but with the gentle amusement of someone who had spent 42 years watching me save everything, just in case, while he lived each day, as if tomorrow was guaranteed. "Honey," I could almost hear his voice saying, "what good is all that saving if you never get to spend it on something that makes your heart sing?" He'd been gone 4 years, but his wisdom had a way of finding me exactly when I needed it most, like letters from heaven delivered through the mail of memory. I walked out of that store feeling like I was carrying more than just a purchase. I was carrying evidence that I still deserved beautiful things, that I could still make choices based on hope rather than fear, that the woman I'd been before loss taught me to expect disappointment was still alive somewhere, underneath all those years of careful invisibility. The red coat was folded in tissue paper that rustled like autumn leaves, nestled in a bag that felt precious as treasure, and with each step toward home, I could feel myself changing, becoming someone who owned something magnificent, someone who had chosen joy over safety. The walk home took longer than usual because I found myself stopping to look in windows, seeing my reflection carrying something beautiful, seeing a woman who looked like she was going somewhere important, like she had something to celebrate. Other people seemed to notice too. The bus driver who smiled and tipped his hat, the man walking his dog who nodded respectfully, the teenage girl who looked at my shopping bag with curiosity rather than the usual dismissal older women learn to expect from the young. It was as if the coat, even hidden in its bag, had changed something about how I moved through the world, how I held my shoulders, how I met people's eyes. Back in my apartment, I hung the coat in my closet with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, stepping back to admire how it transformed the whole space with its presence. It looked strange among my other clothes, the sensible brown sweaters chosen for their ability to hide stains and hide me, the navy cardigans that whispered apologies for existing, the gray slacks that had been selected not for how they made me feel, but for how little they demanded attention. The red coat hung there like a declaration of war against invisibility, like a flag planted in the territory of my own life, claiming space that had been surrendered to practicality and fear. I called it my Red Coat Day, the day I decided to stop apologizing for wanting beautiful things, for taking up space in the world, for believing that I still deserved to be seen and admired and celebrated. It sounds dramatic, but sometimes transformation begins with something as simple as choosing the color that makes your heart sing, instead of the color that helps you disappear into the background of other people's more important lives. The coat was more than clothing. It was permission to believe that my presence in this world was worth announcing, worth celebrating, worth the investment of money I'd saved through months of small denials and careful sacrifices. That night I tried the coat on 3 different times, each time discovering something new about how it made me feel, how it changed the way I stood, the way I breathed, the way I looked at my own reflection, without immediately cataloging everything that time and grief had stolen from me. With my flannel nightgown underneath, it looked ridiculous, but felt like armor against a world that wanted me to fade quietly into the background. With my church dress, it looked elegant and purposeful, like I was someone with important places to go, and people who would notice if I didn't arrive. Standing in my bedroom, surrounded by these carefully chosen pieces of myself, I began to understand that the coat wasn't just clothing. It was a promise to myself that I was done being invisible, done apologizing for taking up space, done believing that beautiful things were for other people, younger people, people who hadn't yet learned that life could be disappointing. The red coat hanging in my closet became my daily reminder that I had chosen hope over fear, beauty over practicality, joy over the safety of never expecting anything good to happen again. What I couldn't have imagined was that this moment, standing in my bedroom holding a receipt for hope, would teach me that sometimes the most profound changes begin not when others finally see us, but when we dare to see ourselves clearly for the first time in years. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, I made an appointment at Helen's beauty salon for the first time in 3 years, my hands trembling slightly as I dialed the familiar number that I'd memorized decades ago, when getting my hair done was a regular ritual, rather than a luxury I'd convinced myself I couldn't afford. Helen's voice on the phone carried the warmth of old friendship, the kind that picks up exactly where it left off, regardless of how much time has passed between conversations. "Margaret? Honey, is that really you? I was just thinking about you last week, wondering how you were getting along." Her voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd spent 60 years breathing hairspray and listening to the secrets women tell when they're in the vulnerable intimacy of a salon chair. Helen had done my hair for my wedding, for my children's graduations, for Harold's funeral, for every important moment that required me to look like the best version of myself. I explained about Thanksgiving, about the red coat, about needing to look like someone who belonged at a family table, and Helen made soft, encouraging sounds that reminded me why I'd always trusted her with more than just my hair. "Oh, honey," she said, "we're going to make you absolutely gorgeous. You come in Tuesday afternoon, and we'll spend whatever time it takes to make you feel like the beautiful woman you've always been." Tuesday afternoon, I walked into Helen's salon carrying the red coat on a hanger, wanting her to see the inspiration for my transformation, wanting someone else to witness the choice I'd made to be seen, to be beautiful, to take up space in the world without apology. The salon looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago, pink walls that had faded to the color of old roses, mirrors surrounded by bulbs that cast the most flattering light known to womankind, and the familiar smell of perm solution and hairspray that had scented every important moment of my adult life. Helen herself looked older, the lines around her eyes deeper like small rivers carved by decades of squinting against cigarette smoke and concentrating on perfect curls. Her movements slightly slower but still deliberate, still purposeful, but her hands were still steady as mountain stone, still capable of working magic with rollers and chemicals and the kind of intuitive understanding of what each woman needed to feel beautiful that can't be taught in beauty school, only earned through years of listening to women's secrets, while their heads soaked in solutions that promised transformation. She was in her 80s now, but still wielding a curling iron like a conductor's baton, still possessing the mysterious ability to see the best version of every woman who sat in her chair, to understand that beauty isn't about hiding flaws, but about revealing the light that's been waiting underneath layers of self-doubt and resignation. When she saw the red coat, her face lit up like Christmas morning, like she was witnessing a miracle she'd been praying for without even realizing it. "Oh, my stars, Margaret, look at you making choices that announce you're alive. This coat is going to change everything about how people see you. But more importantly, it's going to change how you see yourself." She hung it carefully on the hook beside her station, treating it with the respect reserved for garments that carry emotional weight, clothes that represent more than fabric and thread, but choices, declarations, the visible proof that hope still lives in the human heart, even when it's been buried under years of practical disappointments and learned invisibility. As she guided me to the shampoo bowl, her hands gentle on my shoulders in the way that speaks of decades of touching women's heads with reverence, understanding that hair carries memory, that transformation begins with the willingness to let someone else care for you. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into the ritual that had marked every important moment of my adult life. The warm water running over my scalp felt like baptism, like blessing, washing away 4 years of grief and neglect, and the careful invisibility I'd worn like armor against a world that had taught me that women my age were supposed to fade gracefully into the background. Helen's fingers worked shampoo through my hair with the same tenderness she'd shown when I was 30, and preparing for job interviews when I was 40, and trying to look young enough to keep up with the other mothers when I was 50, and fighting the first signs that time was winning the battle against my vanity. It was the kind of touch that reminds you that being cared for is a basic human need, not a luxury, that there's nothing shameful about wanting someone else to tend to you with gentleness and skill, and the understanding that beauty is not vanity, but hope made visible. "Tell me about this special occasion," she said, as she wrapped my head in a towel, warm from the dryer, the heat seeping into my scalp like a small blessing, and I found myself telling her everything about the phone call that had cut through 4 years of silence, like light through a crack in heavy curtains, about the hope that had bloomed in my chest like a flower I'd thought was dead, about the red coat and the choice to believe that beautiful things could still happen to me. Helen nodded knowingly as she sectioned my hair with the precision of a surgeon, each movement deliberate and sure, the kind of understanding that passes between women who've watched each other navigate the complicated geography. The chemical smell of the perm solution made my eyes water. But I didn't mind because there's something about the ritual of transformation that felt sacred, even in Helen's little salon with its outdated magazines filled with hairstyles from decades past, and gossip that traveled faster than wildfire through the tight community of women who understood that beauty was both armor and art, both protection and expression. We'd all sat in these chairs at different stages of our lives, watching ourselves change in these mirrors that had reflected our hopes and fears, and the endless human desire to be seen as worthy of love and attention and care. 2 hours later, when Helen spun my chair toward the mirror, with the dramatic flair of a magician revealing her greatest trick, I gasped so loudly that Mrs. Patterson, getting her weekly wash and set at the next station, looked over in concern. My hair, my poor, neglected gray hair that I'd been pulling back in the same practical bun for 4 years, fell in soft waves around my face like silver silk that had been kissed by light. Each curl caught the overhead bulbs and threw them back transformed, turning my hair from something I'd learned to hide under scarves and behind careful arrangements into a crown worthy of the woman I was remembering I could be. "Now that's a woman who's ready for anything," Helen said, dusting powder off my shoulders with the gentle pride of an artist stepping back from a completed masterpiece, and I could see in her eyes the same satisfaction I'd felt when my garden bloomed perfectly, when my children's faces lit up at Christmas morning surprises, when I'd created something beautiful out of love and patience and the belief that effort spent on making things lovely was never wasted. The transformation was so complete that I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back at me, not because I looked younger, but because I looked like someone who believed she deserved to be seen. I paid Helen $63, money I'd saved by eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch for 2 weeks, by walking to the grocery store instead of taking the bus, by buying the store-brand coffee that tasted like disappointment, but cost half as much as the blend that made morning feel like possibility. Each bill I counted out felt like an investment in hope, in the radical idea that I was worth the expense, worth the time, worth the careful attention it takes to transform oneself from invisible to radiant. Walking home, I caught my reflection in every store window I passed. not from vanity but from the shock of recognition. There was a woman in those windows who looked like someone going somewhere important, someone who had reasons to be beautiful, someone whose presence in the world mattered enough to announce itself with careful curls and the promise of red wool. The teenage cashier at the corner market looked up when I bought milk and smiled with genuine warmth, the kind of smile that told me she was seeing someone worth smiling at. That night, I tried on the red coat with my newly styled hair, and the woman in my bedroom mirror looked like someone I once knew, intimately, but had forgotten how to be, someone who deserved to be seen, to be celebrated, to belong at any table she chose to grace with her presence. The combination of silver hair and red wool created a harmony I hadn't expected, a visual song that spoke of dignity, earned through years of living, of beauty that had nothing to do with youth, and everything to do with choosing to shine. The pumpkin pie recipe was written in my mother's fading script on a card so worn, the edges had turned soft as fabric. Each letter formed with the careful precision of a woman who understood that recipes were more than instructions. They were love letters to future generations, promises that the tastes of home would survive long after the hands that first mixed the ingredients had returned to dust. I'd memorized those measurements years ago, could make this pie blindfolded, but I still pulled out the card every time, running my finger over her handwriting like a prayer, like a conversation with a woman who'd been gone 20 years, but whose wisdom still guided my hands in the kitchen. This pie had been my contribution to every family gathering for 40 years. The one thing they always asked me to bring. The one thing that made me feel necessary, rather than simply invited out of obligation. "Don't forget Mom's pumpkin pie," my daughter would say when coordinating holiday meals. And for a moment I would feel essential, like someone whose absence would create a noticeable hole in the celebration. The recipe itself was simple. 3 cans of pumpkin puree, farm-fresh eggs from the corner market where old Mr. Chen still remembered my name and asked about my arthritis. Spices measured not by teaspoons, but by the memory of how my mother's kitchen smelled on autumn afternoons, when love was something you could taste in the air. Wednesday afternoon, I stood in my tiny kitchen, rolling out pastry with the same wooden pin my mother had used. Her mother before her, the weight of it in my hands connecting me to all the women who had ever hoped their cooking would be enough to earn them a place at the table, to prove their worth through the alchemy of flour and butter and the patient work of hands that understood that feeding people was a form of devotion. The pin was worn smooth by decades of use, its surface bearing the invisible fingerprints of generations of women who knew that food made with love carried prayers in every bite. As the pie baked, filling my apartment with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg that had perfumed every important moment of my adult life, I thought about all the Thanksgivings that had led to this moment. The early years when my kitchen was full of laughter and small hands reaching for batter-covered spoons, when the dining room table groaned under the weight of abundance and gratitude felt as natural as breathing. The middle years when coordinating family gatherings became my specialty, when my house was the gravitational center that pulled everyone home for holidays, when being needed felt as essential as oxygen. The later years haunted me, when the invitations became more formal, more obligation than joy, when I could feel myself becoming the elderly relative people felt duty-bound to include, rather than genuinely wanted to see. When conversations at family gatherings began to flow around me, rather than including me. When I learned to smile and nod and pretend not to notice that my presence had become something to be endured, rather than celebrated. When the pie became less a gift of love and more an admission ticket to a gathering where I no longer quite belonged. I wrapped the cooled pie in my grandmother's lace tablecloth, the one she'd brought from Ireland, in a trunk that smelled of lavender and dreams, yellowed now with age, but still beautiful in its delicate imperfection, still carrying the careful work of hands that understood beauty was worth creating even when no one was watching. Tomorrow this pie would sit among store-bought desserts and fancy presentations ordered from bakeries that charged $50 for what I could make with $5 and 40 years of practice. But it would carry something they couldn't buy. History, love, the accumulated wisdom of hands that had learned patience through repetition, devotion, through service. That evening, I laid out my clothes like a teenager preparing for prom, each item chosen with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that first impressions might be the only chance you get to be seen clearly. The red coat on its padded hanger looked like a flag of hope. My black dress that still fit well, despite the years, seemed elegant rather than merely appropriate. Pearl earrings that had been my mother's wedding gift caught the light like small stars, promising to illuminate my face with their gentle glow. I polished my good shoes until they gleamed like mirrors, pressed my dress with careful attention to every crease, understanding that each preparation was an act of faith in tomorrow's possibilities. That night, standing in my bedroom surrounded by evidence of hope carefully arranged, the pressed dress, the polished shoes, the pearl earrings that had been my mother's wedding gift, and still carried the ghost of her Chanel no. 5, after all these years, I whispered a prayer that surprised me with its specificity, not the general plea for things to go well that I might have offered a younger, more optimistic version of myself, but something more honest, more desperate. Give me the strength to be graceful tomorrow, no matter what form grace needs to take. I couldn't have known that I was praying for something much harder than surviving disappointment. I was praying for the courage to discover what comes after you stop waiting for other people to determine your worth. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold. The kind of November day that makes you grateful for warm coats and heated homes, for small comforts, and the promise of family gatherings that taste like cinnamon and sound like laughter echoing through rooms that know how to hold love. I woke before my alarm at 5:30, my body humming with an anticipation I hadn't felt since Christmas mornings, when my children were small and still believed their mother could make magic happen with nothing but flour, sugar, and the fierce determination that love should taste like something sweet. By 7 o'clock, I was dressed and moving through my morning routine with the careful precision of someone preparing for a sacred ritual. I made coffee in the blue mug Harold had bought me for our 25th anniversary, the one with the chip on the handle that I'd never been able to bring myself to throw away, because some imperfections become more precious than perfection. I sat at my small kitchen table, looking out the window at the bare branches of the oak tree that had watched over this neighborhood longer than I'd lived here, drinking coffee that tasted like possibility, and watching the world wake up around me. The red coat hung on my bedroom door like a flag of hope, like a banner announcing that today would be different, that today I would be someone worth seeing, someone worth celebrating, someone who belonged at the table where gratitude was being shared, and family stories were being told for the 100th time with the kind of repetition that makes them feel like prayers. I checked the clock every few minutes, each glance a small ritual of anticipation, straightening cushions that didn't need straightening, wiping counters that were already clean, my hands needing something to do, while my heart prepared itself for joy. At 11 o'clock I put on the red coat and looked at myself one final time in the hallway mirror that had reflected every version of me over the past 40 years. The woman looking back was someone I'd almost forgotten existed. Her hair caught the gray November light from the window and threw it back transformed into silver threads that looked more like silk than surrender to time. Her coat fit perfectly across shoulders that still carried themselves with dignity, despite everything they'd borne, despite every disappointment they'd learned to carry without complaint, despite every slight that had tried to teach them to slump in defeat. Her eyes held something I hadn't seen in too long: anticipation, hope, the quiet confidence of someone who belonged somewhere, who had been invited not out of obligation but out of genuine desire for her presence. She looked like someone who had stories worth telling, wisdom worth sharing, love worth receiving. She looked like someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone whose absence from the table would leave a noticeable empty space that no amount of food could fill. They'd said they'd pick me up at 2 o'clock. "Don't worry about anything, Mom. Just be ready." My daughter's words echoed in my mind like a promise, like a contract, signed in hope and sealed with the kind of love that survives years of distance and misunderstanding and the complicated dance that families do when they're trying to find their way back to each other after loss has rearranged all the familiar choreography. At 1:30, I positioned myself by the living room window with my pie carrier in hand, my purse over my shoulder, every detail of my appearance checked and double-checked like a soldier preparing for inspection. The street stretched before me, empty of everything except possibility. Gray pavement that would soon witness my daughter's car pulling into the small parking lot, carrying me toward a table where I would once again be someone's mother, someone's guest, someone worthy of being included in the ritual of gratitude and belonging. At exactly 2 o'clock, I stood with my face pressed close to the window glass that had grown cold against my cheek, watching for movement, for the familiar shape of Sarah's blue Honda, for the moment when anticipation would transform into reality. Cars passed on the street beyond my building, a red pickup truck carrying someone else toward their own family gathering, a silver sedan with children's faces pressed against the back windows, a delivery van making its final rounds before the holiday, brought even commerce to a respectful pause. But none turned into my building's small parking lot. None slowed as they approached my address. None carried the face of my daughter behind the windshield. At 2:15, I checked my phone to make sure I hadn't missed a call, that the battery hadn't died at the crucial moment when explanation might come, when the simple logistics of running late might transform anxiety into relief. The screen showed no missed calls, no text messages, no digital breadcrumbs that might lead me toward understanding why the promise was taking longer to materialize than expected. At 2:30, I told myself they were running late. Thanksgiving traffic that snarled the highways between their suburban house and my downtown apartment. Last-minute preparations that had stolen more time than anticipated. The beautiful chaos of a household full of life and laughter and the kind of controlled disaster that happens when love tries to express itself through perfectly timed meals and carefully coordinated arrivals. I moved from the window to my kitchen chair, then back to the window, like a ship caught between two harbors, unable to dock at either one. The weight of the pie carrier was making my arm ache by 3 o'clock, but I didn't want to set it down because setting it down felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, like accepting a reality I wasn't prepared to face. The pie inside was perfect. I knew this without looking, because I'd made this same recipe hundreds of times, had perfected the balance of spices through decades of practice, had learned to read the exact moment when custard sets and crust browns to the precise shade of gold that speaks of home and comfort and love, made edible. I called my daughter's number, my finger trembling slightly, as it pressed the familiar sequence of digits that connected me to the woman who had once lived beneath my heart, who had kicked against my ribs with the fierce determination that would later characterize her approach to everything from walking to talking to the gradual process of pulling away from the mother who had given her life. The phone rang 4 times before Sarah's voice filled my ear, bright and cheerful, and carrying the kind of false enthusiasm that technology adds to human connection. "Hi, this is Sarah. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Have a wonderful day." The recording ended with a beep that sounded like a door closing, like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished writing. I hung up without leaving a message because what could I say? "I'm waiting for you in my red coat, holding a pie that represents 40 years of hoping I still matter to someone." Some truths are too raw for voicemail, too vulnerable for technology to carry safely. I tried again 15 minutes later, and this time the call went straight to voicemail, without ringing at all. The digital equivalent of a door that's not just closed, but locked. A clear signal that Whoever might have answered had made a deliberate choice not to be available for whatever conversation might be trying to happen. My son-in-law's number did the same. Straight to voicemail, straight to the land of unanswered questions and promises that evaporate like morning dew when exposed to the harsh light of reality. In the growing silence of my apartment, I could hear my neighbors through the thin walls that separated my small world from theirs. The Johnsons' television playing football commentary, with the volume turned up loud enough for Mr. Johnson's failing hearing. The sound of grown men chasing a ball across a field, somehow more important than the woman sitting alone in her red coat, 3 feet away. Mrs. Martinez's grandchildren had arrived an hour earlier, with the kind of joyful chaos that announces family. Car doors slamming, children's voices raised in excitement, the sound of multiple conversations happening simultaneously as people who love each other compete for the chance to share their stories. Life was happening all around me, families gathering, tables being set, gratitude being expressed through the ancient ritual of sharing food and stories, and the comfortable silences that come when people know they belong exactly where they are. But I sat in my kitchen chair, still wearing the red coat that had promised transformation, still holding on to the pie carrier like it was an anchor in rough seas, learning the particular weight of hope when it has nowhere to land. At 4:30, I finally set the pie down on my kitchen table, with the careful movements of someone afraid she might break if she moved too quickly, afraid that any sudden gesture might shatter whatever remained of the woman who had believed that red coats could change everything, that careful preparation could guarantee inclusion, that love given freely would always find a place to be received. I removed the coat and hung it back on its hanger, my movements slow and deliberate, smoothing the wool with fingers that barely trembled, a skill learned from years of practice in staying steady when the ground felt unsteady beneath my feet. The afternoon light was beginning to change by 5 o'clock, casting long shadows across my apartment, like fingers pointing toward the truth I wasn't ready to name, that I had been forgotten, not through malice, but through the casual indifference that happens when someone becomes so predictable in their availability that their absence creates no noticeable ripple in anyone else's day. I knew with the certainty that comes from living 73 years and learning to read the silence between promises and reality, what had happened without needing anyone to explain it to me. They had forgotten, or worse, they had remembered and chosen silence instead of honesty, abandonment instead of the more difficult conversation that would require looking into my eyes while explaining why I had become expendable. The realization didn't crash over me like a wave. It settled slowly like sediment in still water, each particle of understanding adding weight to what I already knew, but had been too hopeful to acknowledge. This was the particular cruelty that families specialize in, not the clean break of strangers, but the slow erosion of belonging that happens when love becomes obligation, when presence becomes burden. But as I sat there in my black dress, the red coat hanging like a question mark on its hanger, something else began to stir in the growing darkness of my apartment. Not the wild, desperate hope that had carried me through the morning like a fever, but something quieter, more dangerous, something that whispered that maybe this moment of absolute clarity, this perfect demonstration of my place in other people's priorities, was not an ending but a beginning I had been too afraid to choose for myself. As darkness gathered outside my windows like an old friend who knew when to arrive without invitation, I did something that would have astonished the woman who had waited by her window just hours earlier. I cut myself a generous slice of that perfect pie, the one I had made with such meticulous love, measuring each spice not just with teaspoons, but with the accumulated wisdom of 6 decades spent perfecting the alchemy of making something beautiful for people who might never appreciate the devotion it represented. I ate it slowly, deliberately, sitting at my small kitchen table with only the distant murmur of other people's celebrations seeping through my thin walls for company. But here's what surprised me. It wasn't lonely. For perhaps the first time in my 73 years, I was tasting something I had made, not because someone expected it, not because it would earn me a seat at someone else's table, but because I wanted to honor the woman who had stood in this kitchen for 6 hours, rolling pastry with her grandmother's pin, measuring love in half teaspoons of vanilla. The pie was extraordinary, not because it was different from the dozens I had made before, but because, for the first time, I was the one receiving the gift of my own devotion. Each bite carried the taste of Harold's memory, when he would sneak spoonfuls of filling, while I wasn't watching, the echo of my children's voices, when they were small, and still believed their mother could make magic with nothing but flour and patience, the phantom presence of the woman I had been before. Grief taught me that hoping too much was a luxury that led to heartbreak. But there was something else in that bite, something I had never tasted before, the flavor of freedom. Not the bitter freedom of abandonment, but the sweet, dangerous freedom of realizing that I didn't need anyone else's approval to know the worth of what I had created, what I had offered, what I continued to be in this world, whether anyone was watching or keeping score, or bothering to show up for the daily miracle of my existence. As I sat there in the growing quiet of my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my own capacity to create beauty, to nurture, to love, without condition or guarantee of return, I felt something shift inside me, not break, not heal, but rearrange itself in a way that changed the entire architecture of how I understood my place in the world, how I measured my own value, how I decided what deserved my time and attention, and the precious, limited currency of my remaining years. The phone rang at 6:30, cutting through my newfound peace like a blade through silk, and I let it ring twice before rising from my table, not in desperate hope that salvation was calling, but in simple curiosity about what explanation might be offered for the afternoon I had spent learning that sometimes the greatest kindness you can offer yourself is the radical act of showing up for your own life, even when no one else remembers to send the invitation. When I picked up the receiver, it wasn't my daughter's voice that greeted me, but Mrs. Chen from next door, her words carrying the kind of gentle concern that speaks of someone who had been watching, who had noticed, who understood that sometimes the kindness of strangers carries more healing than the calculated indifference of family. "Margaret, honey," she said, and her voice wrapped around my name like warm cloth against winter skin. "I hope you don't mind me calling, but I made way too much turkey yesterday, and I remembered you mentioning your family plans fell through. I was wondering if you'd like to come share a quiet dinner with me. Nothing fancy, just two neighbors keeping each other company, on a day when nobody should have to eat alone." And in that moment, standing in my small apartment holding a phone that had delivered unexpected grace instead of expected disappointment, I began to understand that sometimes the universe provides exactly what we need, just not packaged in the wrapping we thought we wanted. Sometimes salvation comes not from the people who are supposed to love you, but from the stranger next door who notices when your lights stay on too long, who hears the particular silence that grief makes, who understands that loneliness is not a character flaw, but a human condition that deserves witnessing, that deserves the simple medicine of being invited to someone else's table, without having to earn the invitation through decades of perfect maternal performance. I invited Mrs. Chen into my apartment, and as she stepped across my threshold carrying a plate of turkey that smelled like rosemary and compassion, I realized I hadn't had a guest in my home since Harold's funeral 4 years ago. Not because I didn't want company, but because I'd somehow convinced myself that my small space wasn't worthy of entertaining, that my chipped dishes and second-hand furniture weren't elegant enough to offer hospitality to anyone who mattered. But Mrs. Chen looked around my living room with the appreciation of someone who understood that a home's worth isn't measured in square footage or expensive furnishings, but in the love that's been lived within its walls. She was in her 70s too, a widow like me, though she'd learned to wear her solitude differently, like a comfortable sweater rather than a hair shirt, like something that had been chosen rather than imposed by circumstances beyond her control. Her husband had died 6 years earlier, and I'd watched her navigate grief with a grace that had intimidated me. The way she'd planted a garden in their small shared courtyard, the spring after his death. The way she'd learned to drive at age 71 because she refused to let his absence trap her in the geography of walking distance. We sat at my small table sharing turkey and pumpkin pie, while afternoon faded into evening outside my windows, the combination of her practical kindness and my homemade dessert, creating a meal that fed something deeper than hunger. She admired my red coat, hanging there like a declaration on the back of my bedroom door, and told me about her own disappointments, her own moments of hope followed by silence that taught her the difference between being alone and being lonely, between isolation and independence. "You know, Margaret," she said as she savored a bite of pie that seemed to surprise her with its perfection, "I spent the first 2 years after Chen died waiting for my children to call, to visit, to remember that I existed beyond the obligatory holidays and birthday cards with money folded inside. I sat by that phone like it held the secret to my continued existence, like their attention was the only thing standing between me and complete invisibility. Her chopsticks, she'd brought her own, a beautiful lacquered pair that had belonged to her grandmother, moved with practiced elegance as she spoke. She told me about the day she'd realized that waiting for other people to assign value to her life was like waiting for permission to breathe, that she could either spend her remaining years as a supporting character in other people's stories, or she could start writing her own narrative, one that didn't require anyone else's approval or attendance to be meaningful. The day I stopped waiting for them to make me feel important was the day I started becoming someone I actually wanted to spend time with, she said, and her laughter carried the kind of freedom that comes from letting go of expectations that were slowly poisoning every good moment with resentment. We talked until nearly 9 o'clock, our conversation meandering through topics that women of our generation understand without explanation. The particular grief of watching your children become strangers, the challenge of maintaining dignity in a world that treats aging women like furniture to be politely ignored, the unexpected liberation that can come from having all your illusions stripped away until only truth remains. When she finally prepared to leave, gathering her empty plate and her chopsticks with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to take care of herself and others with equal skill, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt grateful, not the desperate gratitude of someone who had been rescued from drowning, but the genuine appreciation of someone who had been seen clearly and accepted completely by another human being, who understood that kindness doesn't require blood relation or formal obligation, only the recognition that we're all walking through this world carrying invisible wounds that heal faster when someone else notices them and offers the simple medicine of presence and understanding. As she reached my door, Mrs. Chen turned back and said something that would echo in my mind for days to come. "You know, Margaret, that coat doesn't need a special occasion to be beautiful. Neither do you. Sometimes the most important person to dress up for is yourself, and sometimes the most meaningful celebrations are the ones where you're the only guest who matters." And in that moment, standing in my doorway, watching a woman who had learned to bloom in her own garden walk back to her own small apartment, I felt something inside me shift. Not broken, not healed, but rearranged in a way that made everything look different. That Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that November sometimes offers, as an apology for the gray days that bracket it. Sunlight streaming through my apartment windows, with the quality of light that photographers chase and poets try to capture in words that always fall short of the actual experience. I woke without an alarm for the first time in weeks, my body having found its natural rhythm again, now that it wasn't anticipating disappointment or bracing itself against the impact of promises that might dissolve like sugar in rain. I put on the red coat, not because I was going somewhere special, but because I was going somewhere at all. The grocery store, the library, the small park where I used to take my grandchildren back when they still needed their grandmother's hand to cross streets safely, back when my presence in their lives felt essential rather than optional. Each step out of my building felt like a declaration written in footprints on concrete. I am here. I am worth seeing. I take up space in this world whether anyone notices or not, whether anyone approves or not, whether anyone is keeping score or not. The morning air carried the scent of winter approaching, that clean, sharp smell that promises snow and silent nights, and the kind of beauty that exists without needing applause. My red coat moved around me like liquid confidence as I walked down Maple Street toward the heart of downtown, past houses where other families were probably still processing their own holiday aftermath, their own complicated dance of connection and disconnection that defines modern family life. But I wasn't thinking about their stories. For the first time in years, I was fully present in my own narrative, the protagonist of my own Saturday morning, rather than a supporting character waiting in the wings of someone else's drama. At the grocery store, something remarkable happened. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines or change the course of history, but something that changed the course of my understanding of who I was in the world. The young man bagging groceries, a boy who looked barely old enough to shave, but whose eyes held the kind of genuine warmth that can't be faked or trained into customer service representatives, looked up when I approached his counter with my small basket of weekend necessities. "Wow," he said, and his smile wasn't the polite reflex of retail work, but the real smile of someone who had just witnessed something that made his day brighter. "That's a beautiful coat. You look amazing, like you're going somewhere really important." The words hit me with unexpected force because I realized he wasn't seeing an elderly woman grocery shopping alone on a Saturday morning. He was seeing someone whose presence commanded attention, whose choice to wear something beautiful had made the ordinary moment of buying milk and bread into something worth noticing and commenting on. I thanked him, but more importantly, I believed him, not because I needed his approval to know my own worth, but because I was finally ready to see what had always been true. That beauty isn't something that abandons you when you reach a certain age, or when your circumstances don't match the glossy magazine version of what a successful life is supposed to look like. Beauty is something you choose, something you put on along with your coat, something you carry into the world as a gift to everyone whose day might be improved by witnessing someone who has decided to be magnificent despite having every reason to surrender to invisibility. The teenage girl working the register, her hair dyed the kind of purple that announces rebellion against conventional expectations, looked at me with something approaching reverence as she rang up my purchases, her fingers moving efficiently across the barcode scanner, while her eyes kept returning to my coat with the kind of admiration usually reserved for museum pieces. "I love that color," she said as she handed me my receipt. "It looks so good on you. I hope I'm brave enough to wear something that bold when I'm your age. When I'm your age, not as an insult, but as an aspiration, as a goal worth working toward." Walking home with my groceries, I felt like I was carrying more than food. I was carrying evidence that choosing to be visible, choosing to announce your presence in the world with something as simple as a red coat and the confidence to wear it without apology, could change not just how others see you, but how you move through the world. Each reflection I caught in store windows showed a woman who belonged exactly where she was, who had earned her place in the Saturday morning choreography of people running errands and building the small rituals that make ordinary days feel worth living. In the library, I chose a different section than usual, my feet carrying me past the large print mysteries I'd been reading for years, like a form of literary comfort food, toward the travel section that I'd avoided because it felt like looking at a life I'd never have the courage to live. I pulled out books about places I'd always wanted to see, but had convinced myself were dreams for other people, people with more money, more time. more of whatever invisible qualification was required to believe that the world was still available to someone like me. Ireland called to me first, the land where my grandmother's lace tablecloth had been made by hands that understood beauty was worth creating even when resources were scarce, even when survival was the main occupation, and art seemed like luxury. I ran my fingers over photographs of green fields that looked like God's first draft of paradise, of stone cottages that had weathered centuries of storms and still stood proud against the Atlantic winds, of faces that looked like they belonged to people who understood that growing older meant growing into yourself rather than away from who you were meant to be. Italy beckoned with colors like my red coat, bold choices painted on ancient walls, worn by women who understood that choosing beauty over practicality wasn't vanity, but a form of resistance against a world that wanted to render them invisible. The photographs showed markets where vendors called out to customers like old friends, piazzas where people gathered to share stories and wine and the simple pleasure of being alive in the company of others who appreciated the art of living well, regardless of age or circumstance. France whispered promises of a country where women my age were considered elegant rather than irrelevant, where silver hair was seen as sophistication rather than surrender, where the art of living well was practiced by people who understood that age brought wisdom worth celebrating rather than youth worth mourning. I sat in a corner chair that had probably held thousands of dreamers over the decades, turning pages that felt like permission slips to believe that my story wasn't over just because the first chapters had been difficult. That adventure was still available to anyone brave enough to write themselves into new narratives. That afternoon, I called the senior center I'd been avoiding for 2 years, ever since Harold died, and I convinced myself I was too young for such places, too independent to need the companionship of people who might remind me of my own mortality, too proud to admit that loneliness was becoming as familiar as the furniture in my small apartment. The woman who answered the phone had a voice like warm honey, the kind that made you want to tell her secrets and ask for advice about problems you'd been carrying alone for too long. "I'd like to know about your programs," I told her, my voice steady and clear in a way that surprised me, the words coming out with the confidence of someone who had recently remembered that asking for what you want isn't weakness but wisdom, especially when what you want is connection and growth and the chance to discover who you might become when you stop limiting yourself to who you've always been, especially the travel group and the cooking classes and anything else that might help a woman learn to live instead of just survive. She sounded delighted, as if she'd been waiting for my call specifically, as if my voice was the missing piece in some puzzle she'd been working on without realizing it. "Oh, Margaret. You are Margaret, aren't you? I recognize your voice from your husband's memorial service, though I don't think we were properly introduced. I'm Eleanor Whitman, and I've been hoping someone exactly like you would call, because we need women with your kind of life experience to help teach the cooking classes, and our travel group has been wanting to plan a trip to Ireland for 2 years, but needed someone with the organizational skills that come from raising families and managing households." Walking home from the library, my arms full of travel books that felt like possibility, made tangible, I passed the Morrison's department store where I'd bought my red coat 3 weeks earlier. Though it felt like 3 years, so much had changed in the landscape of who I understood myself to be. The same young saleswoman was arranging a window display, her silver nail polish catching the afternoon light, as she positioned mannequins wearing the kind of clothes that announced their wearers believed in beauty, believed in being seen, believed in taking up space in the world without apology. When she saw me through the glass, her face lit up with recognition, and something more. Pride, as if my transformation was partly her own achievement, as if selling me that coat had been less a transaction and more a collaboration in the project of helping someone remember who she was meant to be. She waved with such enthusiasm that other shoppers turned to look, curious about what could generate that much genuine joy between strangers. and I waved back, feeling like I was part of something larger than my own small disappointments, part of a community of women who understood that choosing beauty was choosing hope. That evening, as I hung up my red coat, with the reverence of someone placing a crown back on its stand, I realized something that would change how I saw every choice I'd made and every choice that lay ahead. The coat hadn't changed me. I had changed me. The coat had simply given me permission to remember who I'd been all along, buried under years of other people's expectations and my own fear of taking up too much space, of asking for too much attention, of believing I deserved more than the leftovers of other people's affection. I was a woman worth seeing, worth knowing, worth celebrating, whether anyone else showed up to witness my magnificence or not. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most important lesson of all, the one that could only be learned by someone brave enough to put on a red coat and walk into the world as if she belonged there, because she finally understood that she always had. Monday morning brought a phone call that I'd been both expecting and dreading, the way you anticipate a storm when the air pressure drops and the sky takes on that particular shade of green that promises either relief or destruction, depending on how well prepared you are to weather what's coming. My daughter's name appeared on my caller ID like a ghost materializing in daylight, and for a moment that stretched longer than the actual seconds it contained. I considered letting it go to voicemail, letting her struggle with the machinery of explanation without my voice, as witness to whatever story she'd constructed to make sense of Thursday's silence. But 47 years of being her mother had taught me that some conversations, however difficult, couldn't be avoided forever. They only grew larger and more unwieldy when left unattended, like weeds that spread through a garden. When you convince yourself they'll disappear on their own. I answered on the fourth ring, my voice steady as mountain stone, carrying none of the desperate hope that would have colored it just a week earlier, when her attention still felt like oxygen I couldn't live without. "Mom?" Her voice carried guilt like a fever, high and uncomfortable, and unmistakably recognizable to anyone who had spent decades learning to read the emotional weather patterns of a child who had never been particularly skilled at hiding her feelings, even when honesty required more courage than she possessed. "I'm so sorry about Thursday. Something came up last minute, and we got so busy with Dave's family, and I kept meaning to call. But you know how crazy holidays get, and..." The words tumbled over each other like children trying to explain a broken vase, each excuse smaller and less convincing than the last, each attempt at explanation revealing more about the speaker than it concealed. I listened without interrupting, hearing not what she was saying but what she couldn't say, that I had become the expendable plan, the obligation that could be discarded when something better presented itself, the mother-shaped burden that could be set aside without consequence, because I had trained her through years of my own neediness to expect that I would always be available when she finally got around to remembering I existed. When she finished her litany of reasons why Thursday had been impossible, the silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross, each of us waiting for the other to make the first move toward either forgiveness or honesty. Finally I spoke, my words chosen with the precision of someone who had spent 3 days learning to speak a new language, the language of my own worth, the vocabulary of boundaries I should have established decades earlier. "Sarah," I said, my voice carrying a steadiness that surprised us both, not the trembling hope of a woman desperate for reconciliation, but the calm authority of someone who had spent 4 days learning to speak the language of her own worth. I spent Thursday afternoon in my red coat and my best dress, holding a homemade pie that took me 6 hours to make properly, waiting for a car that never came. I need you to understand what that felt like, not just the waiting, but the hope that preceded it, the careful preparation, the belief that this time would be different, because you sounded different when you invited me, because your voice carried something I hadn't heard in years. She began to apologize again, the same scattered words rearranged in different orders like puzzle pieces that had been cut for a different picture entirely. But I continued as if she hadn't spoken, my voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from finally understanding that being heard is more important than being liked, that speaking truth about what hurt is more valuable than maintaining peace at the cost of your own dignity, than pretending that good intentions can substitute for actual presence when someone you love needs proof that they still matter to you. I also need you to understand that I survived it, Sarah. More than survived it. I learned something important about who I am when no one else is watching, when no one else is keeping score of whether I'm worth showing up for, when I have to choose between waiting for other people to assign value to my life or deciding that my presence in this world matters whether anyone else notices or not. And that's not something I want to unlearn, not even for you, not even to make this conversation easier, not even to go back to being the mother who was always available for whatever leftover attention you had time to offer. The silence that followed was different now, not the empty silence of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the full silence of someone who had just heard something they weren't ready to acknowledge, something that shifted the entire landscape of how they understood their relationship with the woman who had spent 47 years learning to love them without conditions, without guarantees, without the promise that such devotion would ever be returned in equal measure. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried the smaller sound of someone who was just beginning to understand that actions have consequences, even when the people hurt are supposed to forgive you automatically because that's what mothers do. That's what love is supposed to look like. I don't know how to fix this, Mom, she said. And for the first time in our conversation, I heard the daughter I remembered, not the busy suburban woman juggling too many obligations and hoping good intentions could substitute for actual presence, but the child who used to come to me when the world felt too big and complicated to navigate alone, when she needed someone who loved her enough to tell her the truth, even when the truth was difficult. You don't fix it, sweetheart, I told her, my voice gentler now but no less firm, carrying the kind of love that has learned to set boundaries, that understands that enabling someone's thoughtlessness isn't kindness but cruelty, dressed up in maternal martyrdom. You learn from it. We both do. And maybe next time we do better, or maybe next time we don't make promises we're not sure we can keep, which might be the most loving thing we can do for each other right now. 3 weeks later, I was boarding a bus for a day trip to the coast with 12 other women from the senior center, my red coat bright against the gray December morning, like a flag announcing that winter couldn't diminish the warmth of women who had decided to create their own sunshine when the world offered only clouds. The bus smelled of coffee and anticipation, of hand lotion, and the particular perfume that older women wear when they're going somewhere special. Not expensive fragrance, but the scent of soap and powder and lives well lived, of women who understand that smelling good is a form of self-respect that costs nothing but attention. The women were a collection of stories themselves, each face carrying the accumulated wisdom of decades spent learning that happiness is something you create, rather than something you wait for other people to deliver to your doorstep, wrapped in perfect packages. Widows and divorcees sat side by side, sharing snacks and stories with the easy intimacy of people who have learned that loss is not the end of the story, but sometimes the beginning of the most interesting chapters, the ones where you discover who you are when you stop being who everyone else needs you to be. Eleanor Whitman, the group organizer who had become something between a friend and a fairy godmother, over the past 3 weeks, had the kind of laugh that made you want to tell her your secrets, the kind of presence that suggested she had heard every story human beings could tell and found all of them worthy of attention and compassion. She'd taken me under her wing the moment I'd walked into my first meeting, her eyes lighting up when she saw my red coat, as if she recognized it as the uniform of women who had decided to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. That coat, she'd said that first day, tells me everything I need to know about you. You're someone who isn't afraid of being seen, Someone who understands that choosing beauty is choosing hope. Someone who's ready to discover what comes after giving up on other people's approval as the measure of your worth. I'd smiled and thought about how wrong she was, how I was still learning to be brave, still practicing the art of being magnificent, despite having every reason to choose invisibility instead. But as the bus wound along coastal roads, I hadn't traveled in 20 years, past towns with names like poetry, whispered by people who understood that words could carry dreams across generations, past beaches that stretched toward horizons I'd forgotten, still existed beyond the small geography of my daily routine. I began to understand that maybe Eleanor had seen something in me that I was just beginning to see in myself. Maybe bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act with purpose, despite the trembling in your hands, despite the voice in your head that whispered you were too old, too set in your ways, too damaged by disappointment to deserve new adventures. Maybe courage was simply the choice to put on a red coat and show up for your own life, even when you couldn't guarantee how the story would end, even when the audience might be smaller than you'd hoped, even when the applause came only from your own weathered hands, recognizing what you'd survived, what you'd learned, what you'd become in the space between who you used to be and who you were brave enough to discover you could still become. As I watched the ocean appear and disappear behind stands of winter trees, I thought about Harold and how he would have loved to see me learning to be my own companion, how he would have smiled at the woman who was finally keeping the promises she'd made to herself instead of only the ones she'd made to everyone else. We stopped for lunch at a seafood restaurant where the walls were covered with photographs of storms and sunsets, of boats that had weathered decades of seasons and still returned to harbor each evening, carrying their crews safely home. And I found myself sitting next to Grace Morrison, a woman my age who'd started traveling alone after her husband died 10 years earlier. Her face carried the kind of peace that comes from learning to be your own best company, from discovering that solitude and loneliness are entirely different experiences, even though people often confuse them. The first trip was terrifying, she told me, over fish and chips that tasted like adventure, like salt air, and the courage to try new things even when your hands shake slightly from arthritis and your knees protest when you climb bus steps. I sat in my hotel room in Portland, Oregon, wondering what the hell I thought I was doing. A 70-year-old woman traveling alone like some kind of late-life adventurer who'd watched too many movies about women who find themselves by going to exotic places and having transformative experiences. But then I walked down to the waterfront, and I saw this woman about our age painting the sunset, completely absorbed in capturing something beautiful on canvas. And I thought, that's who I want to be. Someone who notices sunsets and isn't afraid to try to capture them. Someone who believes that beauty is worth preserving, even if no one else ever sees what you've created. And that's when I understood that traveling alone isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about discovering who you are when you stop performing the role of someone else's mother, someone else's wife, someone else's supporting character. As we walked along the beach afterward, our coats bright spots of color against the winter landscape that looked like a watercolor painting left unfinished by an artist who understood that some beauty is too vast to be contained within the boundaries of canvas. I thought about my own sunset moments, not endings, but transformations painted in colors I was just learning to see, changes that had nothing to do with other people's approval, and everything to do with my own willingness to believe that my story was still being written, that the most interesting chapters might be the ones I was brave enough to write for myself. The waves crashed against the shore with the kind of persistence that reminded me of my own heartbeat, steady and strong and utterly indifferent to who was listening. And I understood for the first time that there was something profoundly liberating about existing in rhythm with forces that didn't require approval or explanation, that simply were because they had chosen to be, the way I was finally learning to simply be myself, without constant reference to whether anyone else found that self acceptable. On the bus ride home, As the sun set behind us, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that rivaled my red coat, and the lights of our town appeared in the distance like promises of warmth and belonging, I realized with startling clarity that I wasn't the same woman who had put on a red coat and waited for a car that never came just 3 weeks earlier. That woman felt like someone I had once known intimately, but had outgrown, the way you outgrow clothes that once fit perfectly, but no longer suit the person you've become through the mysterious alchemy of choice and circumstance, and the decision to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. I was someone braver now, someone who had learned that the most important appointments we can keep are the ones we make with ourselves, the ones that don't require anyone else's participation or approval, the ones that honor the woman we've been becoming through decades of small choices and large disappointments, and the gradual accumulation of wisdom that comes from surviving long enough to understand that survival isn't enough, that what we're really here for is to bloom where we're planted, to choose beauty over safety, to insist on our own magnificence even when no one is watching or keeping score or offering applause. Will you tell me about a time when you had to choose between waiting for others to see your value or deciding to see it yourself? I'd love to hear your own red coat story in the comments below, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not alone in learning to be our own best company. The red coat still hangs in my closet, though it's no longer the only bright color there. Over the months that followed that transformative Thanksgiving, I've added a yellow sweater that reminds me of sunflowers reaching toward light, a purple scarf that speaks of royalty, earned through surviving rather than inherited through birth, a blue dress that makes me feel like spring rain, nurturing, essential, and utterly unapologetic about making its presence known. Colors that announce rather than apologize, that celebrate rather than hide, that declare to anyone with eyes to see that this is a woman who has learned the difference between existing and living. But that red coat remains special, not because it changed me. I understand now that it was simply the catalyst for a change that had been waiting inside me like a seed that needed exactly the right conditions to finally push through the soil toward sunlight. It was there when I changed myself, witness to the moment I stopped waiting for other people to determine my worth and started determining it myself. There when I learned that the most faithful relationship you can have is the one you have with the person you are when no one else is watching or judging or keeping score. People sometimes ask me about that Thanksgiving, about how I survived what they assume must have been the worst day of my year. And what they don't understand is that it wasn't the worst day. It was the most important day. The day that taught me the difference between being alone and being lonely, between isolation and independence, between waiting for others to include you and including yourself in the grand celebration of being alive in a world that offers beauty to anyone brave enough to put it on and wear it with pride. It was the day I stopped waiting for other people to see my value and started living that value so fully that it became impossible for anyone, including myself, to ignore. It was the day I learned that belonging isn't something others grant you, but something you grant yourself. That dignity isn't distributed by committee, but claimed by individuals who understand that their presence in this world matters whether anyone else notices or not, whether anyone else applauds or not, whether anyone else shows up to witness their magnificence or not. The most profound lesson I learned wasn't about family or forgiveness or the complicated dance of loving people who sometimes forget to love you back. It was about coming home to myself, about becoming the kind of company I actually wanted to keep, about understanding that the best relationships bloom between people who have learned to be whole on their own, rather than people who need each other to feel complete. Some stories end with reconciliation, with families learning to see each other clearly and choose love over convenience. But this story ends with something even more valuable. A woman who learned that she could survive anything, even being forgotten, even being disappointed, even being forced to celebrate alone, because she had finally remembered how to celebrate herself. Sarah and I have found our way back to each other, but it's a different relationship now, one built on mutual respect rather than my desperate need for her approval, one where I can love her freely, because I no longer need her love to survive, one where she can appreciate the woman I've become, because that woman no longer requires her validation to know her own worth. We have dinner once a month now, and sometimes she asks to borrow my red coat for special occasions, and when I see her wearing it, I smile because I know she's beginning to understand what it means to choose beauty, to insist on being seen, to take up space in the world without apology. But the real gift isn't that we've found our way back to each other. It's that I found my way back to myself. I discovered that the woman I'd been looking for in other people's approval, in their invitations, in their validation, had been waiting patiently inside me all along, dressed in red, and ready to step into the world as soon as I was brave enough to let her out. She'd been there through every disappointment, every slight, every moment when I felt invisible, waiting for the day I would finally understand that her worth wasn't up for debate, wasn't dependent on anyone else's recognition, wasn't something that could be given or taken away by people who had never learned to see clearly anyway. The island trip is planned for spring, and Eleanor has put me in charge of organizing the cooking class we'll take in County Cork, where my grandmother's people came from, where women have been making beauty from simple ingredients for centuries, where the art of creating something nourishing from whatever you have on hand is passed down like sacred knowledge from one generation to the next. I think about my grandmother's lace tablecloth, about the hands that made it beautiful despite having so little, about the legacy of women who understood that choosing to create rather than simply survive is always an act of rebellion, always a declaration that hope is stronger than circumstance. Mrs. Chen and I have become the kind of friends I never expected to find at this stage of life, the kind who show up for each other without being asked, who understand that companionship doesn't require constant conversation but presence, who know that sometimes the greatest gift you can give another person is the simple acknowledgement that they exist, that they matter, that their story is worth witnessing. We take turns cooking for each other, sharing meals and silence, and the comfortable knowledge that we've both learned to be good company for ourselves, which makes us better company for each other. The senior center has become less a place I visit, and more a community I belong to, filled with women who wear their stories like jewelry, some painful, some beautiful, all meaningful, in ways that only become clear when you're brave enough to share them with people who understand that living long enough to accumulate wisdom is an achievement worth celebrating. We plan trips and share recipes and laugh about the foolishness of our younger selves, who thought that being needed by others was the same thing as being valuable, who confused being busy with being important, who believed that love was something you earned through perfect performance, rather than something you deserved simply by virtue of being human. I still make pumpkin pie every Thanksgiving, but now it's for the potluck at the community center, where it sits among dozens of other dishes made by hands that understand the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into something that nourishes both body and soul. Last year, 3 different women asked for the recipe, and I wrote it out on new cards in my careful script, adding a note that my mother had written on the original: made with love, served with hope, shared with gratitude. Some traditions are worth passing on, especially when they're received by people who understand their true value. The red coat has become my signature, the thing people associate with me when they tell stories about the woman who learned to bloom late in life, who proved that transformation is always possible if you're brave enough to choose it over safety, beauty over invisibility, hope over the resignation that masquerades as wisdom. But I know the truth. The coat was never magic. I was the magic all along, waiting for the right moment, the right motivation, the right combination of disappointment and determination to finally step into the light I'd been hiding under bushels of other people's expectations for far too long. If this story reminded you of your own red coat moments, those times when you had to choose between waiting for others to see your value or seeing it yourself, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey with me, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Sometimes the most important stories we share are the ones about learning to come home to ourselves, about discovering that the best audience for our lives is the woman looking back at us from the mirror, about understanding that the most beautiful transformations happen not when we're trying to fit in, but when we finally learn to stand out. Thank you for listening, for understanding, and for reminding me that the best stories are the ones that help us remember who we were always meant to be: magnificent, visible, and utterly deserving of our own love and attention.